Many have heard the escapades of Doc Holliday through many of the numerous fictional accounts depicted in the movies, like My Darling Clementine or Tombstone, where Doc Holliday is portrayed by Val Kilmer in perhaps the most believable role. However, the story of Doc Holliday, more accurately the family of Doc Holliday, has its American beginnings in the early colonial period of U.S. history. The first Holliday ancestor who set foot in America was Captain John Holliday, born in England in 1676. About 1700, the Holliday family had settled in the southwest corner of Spotsylvania County, Virginia, where Captain Holliday served as a member of the Virginia Rangers militia. His first son, William Holliday Sr., was born in 1705. William Holliday Sr. married Anne Ayers, and in 1750, the couple welcomed the birth of their son, William Holliday Jr. Shortly after the start of the American Revolution, young 27-year-old William Holliday Jr. enlisted in the 9th Virginia Regiment under the command of Colonel George Matthews. William is shown in this October 1777 payroll as the unit's fife player, earning £2, 4 shillings for a month's service. At the conclusion of the Revolutionary War, William moved to Lawrence District of South Carolina, where he married Jane Cooper about 1785. In 1787, Robert Alexander Holliday was born the second of 6 children. Being raised in Lawrence County, South Carolina, Robert and his brother William were called to serve in Governor Alston's 3rd Regiment of the South Carolina Militia during the War of 1812, Robert as a 3rd lieutenant and William as a private. However, the regiment was not called into action during the war. In June of 1818, Robert Holliday married Rebecca Burroughs of Lawrence County, and 1 year later, the couple welcomed the birth of their first of 11 children, Henry Burroughs Holliday, later to become father of Doc Holliday. Sometime shortly after 1830, Robert moved his growing family to Fayette County, Georgia, in the portion later to become part of Spalding County. On 12 May 1838, 19-year-old Henry B. Holliday enlisted in the 1st Georgia Volunteers under Captain John D. Stills to participate in the Cherokee Indian War and removal. This war was instigated by the notorious Ekataw Treaty signed by the Cherokee Indians and the United States, in which the northwestern Georgia Cherokee Indian tribe agreed to vacate their land for the sum of $5 million. These volunteer militia were inducted into federal action to forcefully remove the Cherokee Indians from their lands in Georgia, often referred to as the Trail of Tears. Most likely, Private Holliday was part of the federal garrison under the command of General Winfield Scott at New Ekataw in Gordon County, Georgia. By the time of the 1840 census, Henry B. Holliday was back home residing with his parents. Though he is not named in the census record, he is the only child of Robert Holliday, who is over 20 and less than 30 years of age. In March 1845, President James Polk took office, and in July of that year, the Republic of Texas voted to be annexed by the United States. On December 29, 1845, Texas joined the Union, though war was threatened by Mexico if they did so. With that threat of war, President Polk called for volunteers to fight against Mexico. A company of men from Spalding County promptly volunteered. They called themselves the Fannin Avengers, named in honor of Georgia farm boys under the command of Colonel James Fannin, who were massacred by Mexican troops at Goliad, Texas in 1836 during the Texas Revolution. Among the Avenger volunteers was Second Lieutenant Henry B. Holliday, now 27 years of age and still single. The company of volunteers marched to Columbus, Georgia, where they joined the regiment under the command of Colonel Henry R. Jackson of Savannah, Georgia. From there, they joined General Zachary Taylor in his incursion into northern Mexico, most likely arriving in time for the Battle of Monterey in September of 1846. The Battle of Monterey was fought September 21st through the 24th, 1846, and was the first major campaign of the conflict conducted on Mexican soil. Following the initial fighting in southern Texas, American troops, led by Major General Zachary Taylor, crossed the Rio Grande and pushed into northern Mexico with the goal of taking Monterey. Nearing the city, Taylor was forced to launch assaults against its defenses as he lacked the artillery to conduct a siege. The resulting battle saw American troops capture the city after taking heavy casualties as they fought through Monterey streets. As a result, General Taylor lost 120 killed, 368 wounded, and 43 missing. The Mexican losses included 367 killed and wounded. As a condition of the Mexican surrender, Taylor occupied Monterey, but allowed the Mexican troops to go free. This negotiated settlement infuriated President Polk and stripped Taylor of 2/3 of his army and ordered them to Tampico. There they were garrisoned to await General Winfield Scott's invasion of southern Mexico using an invasion by sea. Lieutenant Henry B. Holliday was among those volunteers who were sent to Tampico in November of 1846. On March 9, 1847, the invasion finally began as shipload after shipload of U.S. soldiers were rowed ashore in specially built surf boats. They landed on the sands of Colado Beach, located immediately to the south and in view of the great walled city of Veracruz. By nightfall, some 10,000 troops had been put ashore without a single major mishap, a feat which at that time was unprecedented in military history. Afterward, Veracruz was besieged and constantly bombarded for nearly 3 weeks by both land and naval forces. Finally, on March 29, 1847, after severe casualties had been inflicted on both the military and civilian population, Veracruz surrendered. Leaving a small force to garrison the city, Scott immediately began marching inland with the bulk of his troops. On April 18, 1847, near a mountain called Cerro Gordo, the Americans engaged in a battle with Santa Anna troops, who had erected defenses overlooking the road to Jalapa, 12 miles distant. Despite the fact that they had to fight their way to the top of the heights commanded by the Mexican army, with lethal firepower being rained down upon them, the troops under Scott prevailed. The following day, Scott's army occupied Jalapa without firing a shot. At this point, it was necessary for Scott to halt his advance while several regiments of 12-month volunteers were sent back down to Veracruz, from there to take ship to New Orleans, where they were mustered out of service. It is most likely that Henry B. Holliday was among those sent back to Veracruz to await passage back to New Orleans. It is very likely during this delay in Veracruz, awaiting passage back to the United States, Lieutenant Holliday became acquainted and befriended an orphaned 11-year-old boy named Francisco Hidalgo. A family tradition suggests that Holliday helped stow the boy on board a ship, arriving back in New Orleans in June 1847. There, Lieutenant Henry B. Holliday was mustered out of service on June 30th, 1847. The war with Mexico carried on for another 8 months before the American forces under General Scott occupied Mexico City. It is interesting that the treaty negotiations were held in the town of Guadalupe, Hidalgo. On February 2nd, 1848, the treaty was signed, ending the hostilities between Mexico and the United States. Henry Holliday and his young companion, Francisco Hidalgo, returned to Georgia, where Henry began a courtship of Alice Jane McKee, also a South Carolina native. On the 8th of January, 1849, the couple were married in Pike County, already with an adopted son. In the 1850 census, H.G. Holliday, age 31, and his wife, A.J. Holliday, age 21, are enumerated in Pike County, where he is shown to be a druggist with $3,000 in real estate value. Their adopted son, Francisco Hidalgo, is 13. They also have an infant daughter, Martha Eleonora, who was born December 3rd, 1849. Note that the census was taken on the 10th day of December, 1850. In fact, little 6-month-old Martha Eleonora had become ill in a very wet spring of that year and passed away on June 12, 1850, leaving the parents completely heartbroken. How difficult it must have been to recount their deceased daughter's passing. The census required enumeration of her, as she had still been living with them at the time of the June 1st deadline. The following year, on August 14, 1851, in the town of Griffin in Spalding County, Georgia, their only other natural child was born. They named him John Henry Holliday, baptizing him at the First Presbyterian Church on Sunday, March 21st, 1852. Though his parents had great plans for their young son's future, little could they know he would become known as the notorious Doc Holliday. Alice Holliday was a genteel, refined Southern lady who took great pleasure in her new son. She spent most of her time helping young John with his schoolwork, teaching him how to play the piano, or schooling him in manners and other refinements as befitting a Southern gentleman. Henry Holliday was somewhat high-strung and hot-tempered, but still a good man. He became the first clerk of the Superior Court of Spalding County in December 1850. The first Spalding County courthouse, shown here, was completed in 1860, after Henry had resigned his position as county clerk. However, he performed official business here on numerous occasions. Francisco, the adopted son of Henry and Alice, was 15 years old at the time of John's birth. It appears shortly thereafter he became acquainted with the Issam Freeman family in neighboring Butts County near Iron Springs, possibly as a field hand. He was especially fancied by one of Mr. Freeman's daughters, 22-year-old Martha Freeman, 7 years Francisco's senior. In the 1850 census, Martha was 20 years old, Francisco was 13. 4 years later, on June 12, 1854, the couple were married by the local justice of the peace. Francisco was 17 and Martha 24. Soon after their marriage, they started their family with the birth of a daughter, Margaret, in 1855, followed by 2 sons, John T. in 1857 and Issam Dickens in 1859, named after Martha's father. On July 23rd of 1857, Francisco appeared before the Superior Court of Butts County and declared his intent to become a legal citizen of the United States. In his declaration, he stated that he immigrated to the United States in 1847 at the age of 11. He states he was about 22 years old and denied any allegiance to the Republic of Mexico. He signed his declaration with his X mark, indicating he was not able to write. His citizenship was granted. By July 1860, the Hidalgo family had moved to Henry County, Georgia. Francisco now states his age as 24, was farming his own property worth $250 near the community of McDonough. Martha lists her age as 29, Margaret as 5, John as 2, and Issam as 16 months old. The value of their personal property was $350. In that same 1860 census year, the Henry B. Holliday family was living in Griffin of Spalding County. Henry, age 40, listed his occupation as trader. His wife Alice, age 31, has her 3 sisters living with them, as both her parents had passed away earlier. Their son, John H., was now 8 years of age and listed as attending school. Henry's real estate property was valued at $10,490, and the family's personal property at $7,900. The 3 McKee sisters had their own personal wealth. Henry B. Holliday was also a slave owner. The 1860 census slave schedule shows Henry owning 6 slaves, a 41-year-old, a 26-year-old, a 21-year-old, and a 14-year-old, all males, and 2 females, an 11-year-old and a 10-year-old. On the 20th of December, 1860, South Carolina seceded from the Union, and by January 1861, Georgia had also joined the Confederacy. By September, Captain Henry B. Holliday was serving under General Beauregard in the 27th Georgia Regiment at Camp Pickens, Manassas, Virginia. 2 months later, Henry was promoted to major. However, before the following year was out, he was discharged due to ill health from chronic diarrhea and general disability. When Henry was finally able to return to Griffin in 1864, he was horrified to find how all of northern Georgia had suffered heavily from the war. He packed up his family and moved to a 2,500-acre farm near Bemis, Georgia, in Lowndes County. This is where young John Henry Holliday grew up. John Henry's life changed drastically on September 16, 1866. That day, his beloved mother died from consumption, known today as tuberculosis. She had contracted it when the war had forced a poor diet upon her while they were still living in Griffin. She had been the stabilizing force in John Henry's life, and with her death came a melancholy that he would carry with him to his grave. Francisco Hidalgo, a recent naturalized citizen of the United States, also answered the call to the Confederacy in September 1861, joining the Butts County Volunteers under the command of Colonel David J. Bailey. The Bailey Volunteers became Company A of the 30th Georgia Infantry Regiment. By the end of September 1861, they were in camp just below Savannah, Georgia. The 30th served until the spring of 1863 in the Department of South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida, with no engagements, and primarily serving as picket duty. That spring of 1863, the regiment was sent to Mississippi for approximately 6 months in time for the Battle of Jackson, but were not engaged in any combat. However, due to exposure to the chilling damp weather, Private Hidalgo began suffering a severe cold and cough. In late September 1863, the 30th traveled to North Georgia and were engaged in the Battle of Chickamauga. Though Private Hidalgo tried to carry on his military duties, his cough grew worse and pneumonia set in. Finally, in the spring of 1864, he was hospitalized and greatly weakened. Throughout the remainder of the war, his only service was hospital duty, as his strength permitted. The 30th Regiment was engaged in numerous battles until the end of the war. The losses to this regiment by both battle and disease decimated its numbers. Few of the men of the Georgia 30th Infantry Regiment remained at the surrender of General Joseph E. Johnson to General Sherman on April 26, 1865, at Greensboro, North Carolina. Though emaciated and unable to perform any service duty, Private Hidalgo was one of those few survivors of the 30th. Upon his return to Butts County in 1865, Francisco's coughing had become so intense his lungs were hemorrhaging. The doctors confirmed his condition had fully developed into consumption, known as tuberculosis, making his efforts at working his farm most difficult, even on his best days. It would be just a matter of time before the consumption would take his life. Francisco and Martha did expand their family during and after the war, with the birth of Francis in 1862, Fenneman in 1866, Annetta in 1869, and Reuben J. in 1872. In this 1870 census, it is interesting to note that both Francisco and Martha are listed as being unable to read or write, which brings into question how little schooling Francisco may have had while living with the Hollidays. As was noted in Martha's 1891 application for a Confederate widow's pension, Francisco's persistent coughing and lung hemorrhaging made him a total invalid, with consumption finally taking his life on January 13, 1873. The immigrant boy, Francisco Hidalgo, the first American of the Hidalgo family, was laid to rest at the County Line Baptist Church, of which he was a founding member. Meanwhile, down in Lowndes County, Georgia, Henry B. Holliday had remarried, which was not welcomed by John Henry, and he acted out his resentment with pistols. On one occasion, he came upon Negro soldiers swimming in the Withlacoochee River adjacent to the Holliday property. He expressed his displeasure by firing his pistol at the men. There is some disagreement whether anyone was wounded or killed. This incident, about 1870, may have prompted Henry B. to send John Henry off to dental school, also spreading the word around town that the school was the Baltimore College of Dental Surgery. In fact, John Henry was sent further north to the Pennsylvania College of Dental Surgery, which was founded by his cousin, Robert Holliday. He spent much of his time between class sessions at the local gambling halls in the red light district, becoming an expert card player. It was a minor miracle that he even found time to write his required thesis on disease of the teeth by the time he graduated in 1872. Now, J.H. Doc Holliday returned to Georgia and shared a practice with Dr. Arthur C. Ford in Atlanta. But he had developed a chronic cough that threw him into fits, and he had to move his practice to Griffin, Georgia. But again, his health condition got in his way. Finally, his uncle, Dr. John Stiles Holliday, informed him of his diagnosis. He had tuberculosis, the disease that took the life of his dear mother and his adopted brother. His uncle advised him to move to a drier climate where his life expectancy could possibly be extended a couple of years. So in early 1873, Doc Holliday closed his office, sold his remaining property in Spalding County. He may even have attended the funeral of his adopted brother, Francisco Hidalgo, before making his way westward, never to return to his birthplace. Now, much has been written and told about the Western escapades of Doc Holliday, so I won't begin to try to delve into those this evening. Suffice it to say, Doc Holliday lived life like there may be no tomorrow, as that seemed likely the case. He did spend his last years of his life with Wyatt Earp and the Earp brothers. In the outdoor group photo taken near the end of his days, an emaciated Doc Holliday is shown with friends and members of the Earp brothers. He is seated on a chair to the right. His longtime friend and supposed wife, Kate Big Nose Elder, is resting her arm on his shoulder. Although he outlived his uncle's prognosis by 12 years, as was the case of most consumption victims, his last few months were useless, just laying there, waiting to die. The end came on November 8, 1887. He was buried in Glenwood Springs, Colorado, or so they say. Therein is another story for another time. In 1880, the widow Martha Hidalgo was enumerated in the Locust Grove community southeast of McDonough in Henry County. Her name was recorded as Dalgo, and all of her children are still living at home, with the exception of Margaret. She had married in 1872 before her father passed away. John and Issam are doing the farming. Francisco, the daughter, as well as the remainder of the children, are all recorded as being at home. In all likelihood, the Hidalgos had no awareness of the notoriety their adopted brother-in-law and uncle had already achieved out west. In the 20 years between 1880 and 1900, a lot can happen in family and personal histories. Such was the case of the Hidalgo children. Isam Hidalgo was married to Minnie Price in April of 1883. Phinemon Hidalgo was married to Mary Elizabeth Price, Minnie's sister. Francis Hidalgo married Lorenzo Rutledge in March of 1888. Then Phinemon Hidalgo died February 1890. Minnie Hidalgo died a month later in 1890. John T. Hidalgo married Angie Bledsoe in November 1891. Isam, widowed by Minnie, married Exa Turner in January 1893. Reuben J. Hidalgo then married Mary Elizabeth Hidalgo, Finney's widow, in July of 1893. Margaret married her second husband, Thomas Hodge, that same month of 1893. Finally, Francisco's daughter, Annetta Hidalgo, passed away in November of 1896. She never married. Sadly, 8 infant Hidalgo children died during this period. All are buried at County Line Baptist Church near Jenkinsburg. One other family death occurred about this time. Henry Burroughs Holliday, father to the adopted little Mexican boy, Francisco Hidalgo, passed away in Valdosta. He died February 22, 1893. He was buried at Sunset Hill Cemetery, or so they say. There is another story to that as well, but for another time. In 1891, Martha applied for and received a Confederate widow's pension of $100, but not without some question. She was challenged by the state of Georgia whether her deceased husband had contracted tuberculosis while in the service or had been exposed prior to his service. Though her husband had lived with the Hollidays for 5 or 6 years, she stated that he had never been exposed to the condition. However, the warrant was approved and she received the benefit each year until her death. In the 1900 census, Martha Hidalgo, widow of Francisco Hidalgo, was living back in Butts County near Jenkinsburg with her son John T. and his wife and children. She is listed as age 66, but more likely 70. They are living next door to Martha's other son, Reuben J., and his wife and family. The following year of 1901, Martha applied for her yearly pension benefit, signing with her normal X mark. However, her age and hardships of life had taken its toll, and she passed away on November 18, 1901. She was laid to rest next to her dear husband, the little Mexican boy, Francisco Hidalgo. Her tombstone was engraved with the tilde accent used by the family today. In 1900, Isam Hidalgo, age 41, was farming his own property across the county line in the township of LaQuinn in Newton County on the west side of the Yellow River. He was living with his second wife, Exa E., age 26. Also residing in the home were his 2 sons by his first wife, William F., age 14, and John R., age 10, and 3 daughters by Exa, Annie E., 6, Martha E., 4, and Nettie, age 2. By 1910, Isam, now 50, and Exa, 38, had moved back to Bibb County near Jenkinsburg, where Isam was sharecropping on rented property. Exa has given birth to 3 more children, Pearl, 9, Dewey, 7, and Isam Jr., 11 months old. The 2 oldest boys, William F. and John R., have both left home. These boys are the lineage that Berrien Hidalgos descended through. In 1908, William, now going by Frank, as in Franklin, began courting Ruby Heath, and the couple tied the knot on December 30th, 1908. Frank was 23. Ruby was just 14. The couple set up house in the town of Jackson in Butts County, renting in an apartment house on 3rd Street. In the 1910 census, Frank, now 25, and Ruby, 16, have a brand new baby, 2-month-old Hattie Ruth. Tragically, the infant died 1 month later. Their apartment was quite convenient to Frank's workplace, the Carmichael Buggy Factory, 1 block over on 2nd Street. Frank was employed as a blacksmith, a trade he pursued the remainder of his life. Meanwhile, in 1910, John R. Hidalgo, Frank's brother, was living with his uncle Reuben J. Hidalgo and his wife Lizzie. Reuben owned his own farm in Dillard of Monroe County, and he had hired his nephew John R., aged 20, as a farmhand. It appears John R. married Zula Mae Tyson about 1911. John was 20, Zula was 13. Their son, Arthur Horace, was born in 1912. A daughter, Mary Frances, was born in 1913, followed by another daughter, Minnie Elizabeth, in 1916. However, on February 12, 1917, tragedy struck the Hidalgo family when their home caught fire and little 3-year-old Mary Frances was burned to death. With the onset of World War I in April of 1917, John R. Hidalgo registered for the draft in Butts County on June 5th of that year. He was also farming in Jenkinsburg, and with 2 surviving children, he claimed a military exemption. His physical features were medium height, slender build, brown eyes, and black hair. Frank also registered for the draft, but not until September 12, 1918, 2 months before the end of the war. He was working as a farm laborer for Reuben J. Hidalgo, his uncle, who had moved back to Henry County. He claimed no exemption. His height was medium, build was medium, with brown eyes and black hair. In 1920, Isam D. Hidalgo, age 60, and his wife Exa, age 46, were living in Flovilla, near Indian Springs of Butts County. They had their widowed daughter, Elva Williams, and her daughter, Hazel, living with them, as well as their 2 youngest surviving boys. Isam Jr. had passed away in 1916 at the age of 7. His oldest son, Frank, is renting a farm and sharecropping near Jenkinsburg in 1920. He is enumerated as William F., age 34. His wife, Ruby, is 26. They have 5 surviving children, all girls. Lizzie M. is 8, Dorothy J. is 5, Luraline is 3, and Montez is 1 year old. In that same census year, 1920, Frank's brother, John R., is living nearby, also sharecropping on a rented farm. He is 29, and his wife, Zula, is 22. They have 4 surviving children: Arthur, now 8, Elizabeth, 4, Tyson Lamar is 2, and a newborn Talmadge Walter is 4 months old. About 1923, Isam and Exa Hidalgo had retired from the farm and moved to Atlanta, where Isam offered his services as a carpenter. He moved about quite frequently, from one rental to another over the next 10 years. In 1930, they had their 18-year-old grandson, Arthur Horace Hidalgo, John R.'s oldest son, boarding with them. In 1935, he was a watchman at a laundry company where his sons, Don and Dewey, were also employed. In 1930, Frank Hidalgo had given up on his sharecropping and had moved into Jenkinsburg, where he was renting a home for $6 a month. His occupation was listed as auto mechanic and operating a home garage. His family has grown to 7 surviving children, all girls: Elizabeth, 18, Dorothy, 15, Valley, 13, Doris, 11, Hilda, 9, Ina, 6, and Sylvia, age 2. That same year, John R. Hidalgo had moved back to Dillard in Monroe County, where he had purchased and was working his own farm. John, 40, and Zula, 34, had 5 of their children living at home: Minnie Elizabeth, 14, Tyson, 12, Talmadge, 10, John R. Jr., 7, and Alton, 4. Their oldest son, Arthur Horace, was residing with his grandparents, Issam and Exa Hidalgo, in Atlanta. By 1935, Issam and Exa were both in failing health and had moved in with their daughter, Elam, and son-in-law, John Capps, on North Avenue Northeast in Atlanta. 2 years later, on November 30th, 1937, Exa Hidalgo passed away. She was 65. 3 years later, Issam Dixon Hidalgo also gave up mortality, passing away on May 27, 1940. He was 81. They lay at rest side by side at the County Line Baptist Cemetery in Butts County. Shortly before 1935, Frank Hidalgo moved his family to Nashville in Berrien County, Georgia. Though most of Frank and Ruby's family had already left home by the time of the 1940 census, the couple had finally added a boy, Billy, age 9. They were living at 524 East Washington Avenue, where Miller's Hardware Lumber Yard sits today. He was self-employed as a blacksmith, operating his shop where the Berrien Press now stands. In this photo, taken from the courthouse tower in the 1950s, a portion of Frank Hidalgo's blacksmith shop can be seen in the upper left, in front of the Union Warehouse. The whereabouts of John R. and Zula Hidalgo in 1940 is a bit of a mystery, as I could not locate their census record. However, on her son Alton's 1942 military registration card, it states he and Zula are living in Vienna, Georgia, at 105 Yeoman Street. No mention is made of John R., but assume he is residing there as well. The family of John R. Hidalgo were well represented in their service during World War II. This news item in the Macon News and Telegraph recognized Zula Hidalgo as a 4-star mother with 4 sons in uniform. Tyson was in the Navy, while Talmadge, Alton, and John R. Jr. were in the Army. John R. and Zula's oldest son, Arthur H. Hidalgo, was married about 1935 to Irene Waits. At the time of the 1940 census, Arthur, age 27, and Irene, age 24, have 3 children: Wade, 4, Myrna Loy, 3, and Barbara Ruth, age 2 months. The family is also living in Vienna, renting a home at 494 on 8th Street for $7 a month. Arthur is working at a sawmill in town. Shortly thereafter, Arthur and Irene Hidalgo moved their family to East Berrien, where Arthur sharecropped for K.M. Miller on his property near Lake Lewis. About 1942, the couple welcomed their fourth child, Shirley Ann, born in Lakeland, Georgia. In the 1950s, Arthur was engaged in the bee and honey production business, which he pursued most of the remainder of his life. All four of the children were attending school at the new Berrien High. By 1959, Frank, Ruby, and what remained of the family still living at home had moved on the west side of Nashville into a small cottage at 611 Gary Street, across from Westview Cemetery. The family of Frank and Ruby were always a point of discussion, with 7 girls and just 1 boy. However, family gatherings were an occasion to celebrate the disparity by lining up in the order of their births: Majora, Dorothea, Peggy, Montez, Hilda, Ina Frank, Sylvia, and of course, Billy. Having lived a full life with many children, many joys, and a few disappointments and tragedies, Ruby Hidalgo passed away on December 20th, 1964. Decembers would always have a bit of melancholy, as William Franklin Hidalgo also passed away in December, 5 years later, on Christmas Day, 1969. The couple are buried at Westview Cemetery. In a 1969 city directory, Arthur and Irene Hidalgo are living at 1510 East Washington Avenue in Nashville. Arthur is listed as a machine operator for the Allied Farm Equipment Company on West Washington. Irene is listed as a cashier at Levine's Foodland Supermarket on Davis Street. Arthur and Irene went on to share their love of life and family for decades. Arthur passed away on July 30th, 1984. He was 73. He is buried at Flat Creek Cemetery. Irene passed away on December 9th, 2001, and is buried at Beaver Dam Cemetery. As all Hidalgos, gatherings of family is a festive occasion. The numbers of Hidalgos in Berrien County are still growing and blending in with other pioneer families of the community, but they all have a unique heritage that they celebrate and honor. These 2 Hidalgo relatives are the progenitors of most Hidalgo families who live or have lived in Berrien County, and they all have their origins with Isam Dickens Hidalgo, son of Francisco Hidalgo, the little Mexican boy who was brought in the United States by the father of the notorious John Henry Doc Holliday. While the life of the natural son of Henry Burroughs Holliday ended in tragic notoriety and death, he left behind only legends and no posterity. In contrast, the life of his adopted son, a poor little Mexican boy who could neither read nor write, left behind a heritage of honesty, hard work, and perseverance, and a posterity that number in the hundreds, if not thousands. That is the true message of Doc Holliday and the Berrien Hidalgos.